The call, that STOPPED, Harlem. Harlem had its own heartbeat in those days. It wasn't the kind you heard with your ears, it was the kind you felt in your bones. The shuffle of shoes on Lenox Avenue, the echo of jazz leaking from basement clubs, the quiet prayers whispered behind church doors, the tension that lived between every streetlight after sundown. And at the center of that rhythm stood one man who understood Harlem better than anyone else, not because he ruled it with fear, but because he listened to it like a living thing. Bumpy Johnson had just returned home when the phone rang. It was late, too late for casual calls, too early for comfort. The kind of hour where bad news traveled faster than truth. He hadn't even removed his coat. His wife Mame had been out earlier that evening, visiting a friend across town, promising she'd be back before night fully swallowed the streets. She always kept her word. Except tonight. The phone rang again before Bumpy could take another step. He answered it slowly, instinct already tightening his chest, the way it did when something precious slipped out of balance. The voice on the other end was calm, almost polite, which made it worse. "She's safe," the man said, "for now." Bumpy didn't speak, he didn't need to. Silence had always been his sharpest weapon. "You have 4 hours, the voice continued. "Do exactly what we say and she comes home. Try anything clever and Harlem loses its queen." The line went dead. Bumpy Johnson stood there, phone still in his hand, the room suddenly too quiet, too empty, too cold. In all his years navigating Harlem's shadows, negotiating peace between rival powers and keeping violence from spilling into innocent lives, he had learned one unbreakable rule. When threats came wrapped in politeness, they were never bluffing. Mame was not just his wife. She was his anchor. She was the reason he left rooms before midnight, the reason he refused deals that smelled wrong, the reason children in Harlem could walk to school without stepping over broken promises. She saw the man beneath the reputation, the man who read poetry alone at night, who carried guilt like a second heart, who believed that power meant responsibility. And now someone had taken her. Bumpy didn't shout, he didn't punch walls, he didn't curse the sky. He sat down. People who misunderstood him thought calm meant weakness. Those people never lived long enough to repeat that mistake. 4 hours. Not to panic. Not to beg. To move. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small notebook, old, worn, filled with names, favors, debts, and memories. This wasn't about muscle. Anyone could send men with guns. This was about precision. He needed to know who dared to cross a line no one crossed. Mame was being held somewhere quiet, somewhere chosen by someone who believed they understood Harlem but didn't love it. Outsiders made that mistake. They saw territory, Bumpy saw people. He began with the churches. In Harlem, nothing moved without the churches knowing. He made 2 calls, no details, no names, just a simple question: has anyone unusual been seen tonight? Vans, new faces, strange movements. Then the barbershops. Barbers heard everything. Loose tongues trusted mirrors. He didn't ask for loyalty. He reminded them of history, of streets protected, of children safe, of favors never collected. Then the women. Harlem's strongest network wasn't run by men. It was run by mothers, wives, sisters, and widows who watched everything from behind curtains and stoops. Bumpy had never disrespected them. Tonight he relied on them. Within 40 minutes, the picture began to form. A car with out-of-town plates. Men who asked the wrong questions. A warehouse near the river that hadn't been used in months, but had lights tonight. Bumpy checked his watch. 3 hours and 10 minutes left. He didn't go to the warehouse. Not yet. First, he had to make something clear. He placed one final call to a man who controlled routes beyond Harlem, a man who owed Bumpy his freedom from a past mistake. The message was simple. Shut the doors, nobody moves without my say. If the kidnappers wanted money, they wouldn't find a way out. If they wanted leverage, they'd realize they'd grabbed the wrong woman. Because Mame Johnson was not a weakness. She was a mirror. And anyone who looked into it would be forced to see exactly who they were. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit room by the river, Mame sat calmly, hands folded, eyes steady. Her captors expected fear. They didn't understand that living beside a powerful man for years teaches you something far greater than fear. It teaches you control. She listened, she watched, she spoke only when necessary. She noticed which man avoided eye contact, which one hesitated, which one checked his watch too often. And she knew something they didn't. Bumpy Johnson would not rush. He would not negotiate from panic. He would arrive prepared. Back in Harlem, Bumpy stood, finally removing his coat. 4 hours had begun. And by the time they ended, the streets would remember what true power looked like. Not loud, not cruel, not reckless, but unbreakable. 4 hours of silence. Time did not move normally after that phone call. It stretched and bent, becoming something heavier, something alive. In Harlem, clocks still ticked, streetlights still hummed, and music still drifted from open windows, but for Bumpy Johnson, the world had narrowed to a single truth. Every second that passed without Mame beside him was a second stolen, and stolen time demanded repayment. Yet even with that weight pressing on his chest, he refused to let desperation steer his hands. Panic destroyed more men than bullets ever could, and Bumpy had survived long enough to understand that control, not force, was what decided who walked away intact. He moved through Harlem that night without being seen, not because he hid, but because the streets themselves seemed to step aside for him. Doors opened before he knocked, conversations stopped when he entered, and eyes followed him not with fear but with trust. This was the part of his reputation no one wrote about, the part built not on threats but on years of protecting what others exploited. He listened more than he spoke, absorbing fragments of information that on their own meant nothing but together painted a clearer picture. The kidnappers were nervous, unfamiliar with Harlem's rhythms, making small mistakes that only outsiders made, and most importantly, they were waiting for instructions that had not yet come, which told Bumpy something critical. They were not the ones in control, only the hands executing someone else's plan. As the second hour approached, Bumpy chose to do something unexpected. He went home, not to rest, not to sit with memories, but to think where the air was quiet and his mind sharpest. He sat at the table where Mame used to leave notes reminding him to eat, to sleep, to remember that even powerful men were still human, and he allowed himself exactly one moment to feel the absence she left behind. It was not weakness, it was fuel. He thought of her calm voice, her steady gaze, the way she never asked for explanations but always understood the answers. Anyone who believed she was a liability had never truly known her, and that misjudgment was already working against her captors. Meanwhile, Mame remained composed in the dim warehouse, not because she underestimated the danger, but because fear would have given them control she refused to hand over. She paid attention to the silences between conversations, to the way one man paced while another stayed still, to how their confidence thinned with every unanswered call. They expected Bumpy to react loudly, to make threats, to rush toward violence, and his refusal to do so unsettled them far more than anger ever could. In that quiet, Mame understood what they did not. Her husband was not preparing an attack, he was tightening a net, and nets were most dangerous when you didn't realize you were already inside one. Back in Harlem, Bumpy began closing doors. Routes that usually moved unnoticed suddenly stalled, favors that were normally exchanged freely were put on pause, and messages were sent that carried no threats but heavy implications. Harlem was a living system, and when one piece stopped moving, everything felt it. The kidnappers' handlers began to sense something was wrong, not because Bumpy announced himself, but because nothing worked the way it should have. Phones rang without answers, cars waited longer than expected, and promises that were once guaranteed became uncertain. Power, Bumpy knew, was not about how hard you could strike, but about how many options you could quietly remove. As the third hour loomed, Bumpy finally made contact, not with the men holding Mame but with the person above them, the one who believed distance made him untouchable. The conversation was brief and polite, almost respectful, which made its message unmistakably clear. Bumpy did not threaten harm, did not raise his voice, and did not mention retaliation. Instead, he calmly explained how many people were already aware that a line had been crossed, how many alliances were reconsidering their silence, and how quickly a reputation could collapse when it became associated with breaking rules everyone depended on. The call ended without agreement, but agreement was never the goal. Awareness was. In the warehouse, the mood shifted. The men grew quieter, their movements sharper, their confidence thinning as instructions failed to arrive. One of them looked at Mame differently now, not as leverage but as a liability, and that change told her everything she needed to know. Bumpy was close, not in distance but in influence, and influence traveled faster than footsteps. She remained still, her calm now a mirror reflecting their uncertainty back at them, forcing them to confront the truth they had tried to ignore. They were no longer in control of the situation they had started. As the final hour approached, Harlem itself seemed to hold its breath. Bumpy stood by a window, watching the city that had shaped him, knowing that whatever happened next would be remembered not for how loud it was, but for how decisive. He was prepared to do what was necessary, but he was equally prepared to stop it from ever reaching that point, because true strength was measured by how much harm you prevented, not how much you inflicted. Whoever had taken his wife believed they were dealing with a man driven by rage, and that misunderstanding was about to cost them everything they thought they held. By the time the clock edged closer to the fourth hour, the balance had already shifted. The kidnappers felt it, their handler felt it, and somewhere between silence and realization, they understood too late that Bumpy Johnson was not racing against time. He was reshaping it, turning every passing minute into pressure they could no longer withstand. The legend was not being built through violence, but through restraint, clarity, and an unbreakable resolve that made one truth impossible to escape. Mame Johnson was coming home, and nothing about this night would ever be forgotten. The mistake that ended everything. By the time the fourth hour drew near, the city no longer felt neutral. Harlem itself seemed to lean in one direction, as though the streets, buildings, and shadows had silently chosen sides. Bumpy Johnson stood perfectly still in that moment, not because he lacked urgency, but because stillness was now his advantage. Everything that needed to move was already in motion, and everything that needed to stop had already been halted. The men who believed they controlled the night were discovering a truth far more unsettling than resistance. They were being ignored, and in Harlem, being ignored by the system meant you no longer existed within it. The kidnappers made their fatal mistake not out of cruelty, but out of fear, which was always the most dangerous emotion for men who believed they were powerful. Unable to reach their handler, unable to understand why their leverage was dissolving instead of increasing, they decided to force urgency where patience would have saved them. They contacted Bumpy again, this time with a voice that tried to sound firm but carried cracks of uncertainty beneath every word. Demanding immediate compliance and threatening consequences they no longer had the means to deliver. Bumpy listened quietly, allowing the silence between their words to stretch just long enough to expose their desperation, and when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, steady, and devastatingly precise, explaining without anger that time was no longer theirs to measure, and that every decision they made from this point forward would only decide how cleanly this situation ended. In the warehouse, Mame sensed the shift before it was spoken aloud. The men moved differently now, their confidence replaced by urgency, their conversations shorter and more fragmented, their eyes darting toward doors and windows as if the walls themselves might betray them. She understood then that the power dynamic had inverted, that she was no longer the reason they felt strong but the reason they felt trapped. She spoke for the first time not to plead or protest, but to state a simple observation, calmly pointing out that whatever plan they believed they were part of had already unraveled, that the man they underestimated had never needed to announce himself to be present, and that the smartest thing they could do now was stop pretending they still had choices. Her words were not threatening, but they landed heavily, because truth delivered without fear had a way of stripping illusions bare. Bumpy, meanwhile, made his final move without stepping outside or raising his voice. He contacted the one institution that existed beyond territory, beyond deals, beyond reputation, consequence, not through violence, not through exposure, but through alignment. Every group that depended on stability, every figure who relied on rules being respected, now understood that allowing this breach to stand would invite chaos none of them could control. What had started as a private crime became a collective liability, and once that transformation occurred, the outcome was no longer a negotiation but a correction. Harlem did not need Bumpy to order anything, it corrected itself when balance was threatened. The kidnappers felt it all at once, like a door quietly locking behind them. Roots closed, allies disappeared, and the realization set in that even if they released Mame, the night they had created would follow them forever. One of them finally admitted what the others feared, that this was never about money or leverage, that they had crossed a line that existed not on maps but in memory, and that Harlem remembered everything. Panic gave way to resignation, and resignation to the understanding that survival now depended on surrender, not defiance. When they decided to let Mame go, it was not framed as mercy but as necessity, and that distinction mattered. She was released not because they suddenly found compassion, but because the pressure surrounding them had become unbearable. The moment she stepped out into the night air, escorted not by fear but by inevitability, the situation effectively ended, not with noise or spectacle, but with a quiet finality that left no room for retaliation or misunderstanding. Bumpy did not rush to her side in dramatic fashion. He waited, because he knew she would arrive not as someone rescued, but as someone who endured. When they were finally reunited, there were no raised voices, no public display, no need for explanation. Their embrace was brief but complete, carrying relief, respect, and an unspoken understanding that what had happened would not define them, but what followed would. Bumpy did not celebrate, did not issue warnings, and did not allow the night to become legend through exaggeration. Instead, he ensured that the aftermath was orderly, that no innocent lives were disrupted, and that the lesson was absorbed without spectacle. Power, after all, was most effective when it left no scars on the community it protected. By dawn, Harlem resumed its rhythm, but something had changed beneath the surface. The story spread not through headlines or boasts, but through quiet acknowledgement, through knowing looks and lowered voices, through the shared understanding that certain lines were permanent and certain bonds untouchable. The legend was not that Bumpy Johnson acted in 4 hours, but that in those 4 hours he proved something far more enduring. That strength guided by restraint outlasted strength driven by fear, and that love, when paired with intelligence and resolve, became something no threat could ever overcome. What Harlem remembered. Morning arrived quietly, as though the city itself chose not to disturb what had already been settled. Sunlight crept between buildings, touching stoops and sidewalks that had borne witness to countless untold stories, yet none quite like this one. Harlem resumed its rhythm, but beneath the surface, people felt a difference they could not immediately name. It was not fear and it was not excitement, it was reassurance. The kind that comes when chaos threatens, but is stopped before it spills into the lives of the innocent. Bumpy Johnson walked those streets that morning not as a conqueror or a hero, but as a man who had carried a heavy truth through the night and laid it down without asking for applause. What followed was not retaliation, spectacle, or whispered threats. What followed was silence, and that silence spoke louder than any warning ever could. The people responsible for crossing that line faded from relevance, not hunted, not humiliated, but erased from the equations that mattered. Their names stopped being mentioned, their influence dissolved, and their ambitions collapsed under the weight of a lesson they had learned too late. In Harlem, survival depended not on aggression but on understanding, and those who failed to understand were quietly removed from the future without another word needing to be spoken. Mame returned to her routines with a calm that unsettled those who expected visible scars. She attended gatherings, spoke with neighbors, and moved through the world with the same steady grace she had always carried, yet those who looked closely could see something deeper in her eyes, not fear but clarity. She had seen the true measure of power stripped of illusion, and it had not frightened her, it had strengthened her resolve. She understood now more than ever that her presence beside her husband was not symbolic, but essential, and that the balance they created together was something no external force could easily disrupt. Bumpy, for his part, refused to let the night define him publicly. He declined interviews, dismissed exaggerated retellings, and corrected no rumors, allowing the truth to settle into its proper shape without his interference. He knew that legends built on noise eventually collapsed, while those built on quiet certainty endured. When asked indirectly about what had happened, he responded only with reminders about responsibility, about protecting the community before protecting ego, and about the dangers of confusing power with recklessness. Those who listened carefully understood that these were not platitudes, but boundaries drawn in plain language. Harlem absorbed the lesson gradually, not as a warning, but as a reassurance that certain values still held weight. Children continued walking to school without fear, businesses reopened without tension, and conversations returned to music, family, and possibility. The city had witnessed many conflicts, many storms, but this one ended without destruction, and that outcome mattered more than any dramatic resolution ever could. People spoke of that night not with excitement, but with respect, understanding that something fragile had been protected, not shattered. In private moments, Bumpy and Mame spoke little of the details because they did not need to. What mattered had already been said through actions, through trust, and through restraint. They understood that survival was not just about making it through danger, but about emerging without becoming something you could no longer recognize. That understanding became the foundation of everything that followed, shaping decisions, guiding boundaries, and reinforcing the quiet partnership that had always been their greatest strength. Years later, when people spoke of those 4 hours, they rarely agreed on the specifics, but they always agreed on the outcome. The legend was not that a man acted swiftly, but that he acted wisely. Not that he dominated through force, but that he preserved peace through discipline. Not that he saved someone through violence, but that he protected a bond through intelligence, patience, and an unwavering refusal to let fear dictate his choices. That was the story Harlem carried forward, passed not as a warning, but as an example. And so the night became memory, memory became lesson, and lesson became legacy. A reminder that true strength does not announce itself, that love guided by resolve is the most unbreakable force of all, and that sometimes the most powerful thing a man can do in 4 hours is not to destroy, but to protect everything that truly matters.